All right, welcome back to another edition of Castos Office Hours. My name is Craig Hewitt. I'm the founder of Castos. Thanks so much for hopping in today and chatting with us about podcasting. I'm joined today, as always, by Denise Mekel from our marketing group. Denise, how's it going?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Awesome. Yep, I'm doing good. Have a cool topic to talk about today. So, kind of as usual here in office hours, the format is going to be we're going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes on a particular kind of micro topic in podcasting, and from there we're going to hop into your questions and answers. So, for folks who are just coming in, if you could pop in the chat and say hi and where you're logging in or calling in from today, that would be great. We will let folks give them a couple of extra minutes to get logged in and everything. And we also have a poll going. So if you scroll down on your screen here towards the bottom, you'll see a poll about how many episodes you've published. So I just wanted to get a feel for the folks here today of kind of how many episodes you've published. If you're just getting started, if you've been publishing for, producing podcasts for a little bit, or, pretty much you're a pro. So just wanted to get a feel for this because this is kind of pertinent to the topic we're talking about today. And then as you have questions, or if you're coming in with questions, also kind of towards the bottom of your screen, there's a questions tab, and you can pop your question in there, and we will take those at the end of our kind of presentation bit. Awesome. Juwan from Alabama, never published. All right, you're in the right place. I think, Denise and I were talking just before we went live that, office hours really is a place for folks who are just getting started with podcasting. That tends to be the people who get the most value out of it, because like Juwan, you can come in and ask questions that you can't find an answer to in blog articles or Facebook groups, or if you just want to kind of chat about something, that's really the best place to come is something like this where we can chat about whatever topics you have. So for folks who are just coming in, if you could pop in chat and kind of say, hey, and where you are calling from or logging in from. And then if you could go into the bottom area of your screen there into the polls section and answer our kind of quiz or poll question about how many episodes you've published. That would be awesome. And as you have questions, feel free to pop them into the questions area, also at the bottom of your screen. So if you kind of scroll down on your screen there, you can ask whatever questions you have at any time, and we'll talk for about 10 minutes on kind of creating really awesome content. That's our topic for the day, and then we're going to do Q&A after that. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with a bit of kind of content that we have. And folks who are kind of coming in can pop questions in the bottom there or in chat, whichever you'd like, and we'll get those here in just a few minutes. So the agenda for today is really twofold. So the first is talking about creating really standout content and why that's so important. And then we'll go into some Q&A after that. And so the first part will be 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for the rest of the hour. So why are we talking about creating standout content? And the reason I think is that even though podcasting is really a pretty new form of content marketing, as opposed to things like blogging or emails or YouTube or social media even, it is becoming really, really competitive, and particularly in some kind of categories and niches of podcasting. The competition is fierce. And so if you're just getting started, especially creating just another kind of Me Too podcast, is going to be tough to kind of increase your listenership. And so what we say a lot is that folks who really want to be successful at podcasting, you have to create good sounding audio and you have to know how to publish and all this kind of stuff. But you can kind of screw up a lot of that stuff if you get the content part of it right. So all of the other technical stuff that a lot of folks worry about is important, like to a certain level. But the place to have like exponential growth and success of your podcast is in creating really great content. And so that's why I thought it was worth talking through today. And so we have 7 steps or ideas or things that we can think about that will lead us towards creating really great content. And the first is to be passionate about your topic. And this may seem really obvious to everybody, but especially if you're just getting started, remember that you will be talking about this every week for years. For my podcast, we're coming up on our 200th episode, and my co-host and I have been talking about business and entrepreneurship and all this kind of stuff for 200 episodes. And fortunately, we're still really excited to record almost every episode, not quite every episode, but pretty much. And it's because it's something that's like near and dear to our heart, that we live in every day and that we're really passionate about. And so I think this is like a kind of building in a key for success. If you pick a topic that you're passionate about, you know a lot about, you're living in every day, then getting on the mic and talking about it every week, or having interviews or being with a co-host and talking about it will kind of set you up for success. Doing the opposite will make creating content and engaging with your audience and creating good content really difficult. So that's kind of like, we put this first because it really is the beginning and the essence of creating good content. The second is to identify your ideal listener persona. And so we have a worksheet around this, and we can probably include the worksheet either in the chat, and I'm putting Denise on the spot here, or in an email to everybody later on. And we have this worksheet that kind of talks through like exactly identifying one person who is the ideal person that you want a podcast for. And so you give this person a name and you talk about, their gender and where they live and how old they are and what they're interested in and what their pains are and what their ambitions are. And when you do all this stuff, you get a really clear sense of, Larry, the podcast listener, he lives in New York. He's 45 years old. He likes underwater basket weaving or whatever. He wishes he could quit his softball team so that he has more time for basket weaving, and all this kind of stuff that you get really, really specific about, like exactly who you think your podcast is for. And then what this does is makes all of the content questions that you have later on, like, hey, should I have this person on my podcast? Or hey, should I talk about this thing this week? You just kind of, you think about Larry, right? And you say, wow, Larry would dig this, or he wouldn't. And so you don't talk about it. So really going through the exercise, print this worksheet out, do this exercise like on paper, not on your computer, but on paper where you have time to really kind of ruminate about it, is really a worthwhile thing. And because this answers a lot of questions that you'll have down the line about what content you should create and what you shouldn't. And so the so what kind of after that is, once you've decided kind of who you should be talking to and what you should be talking about, is to stay on topic. I think it's easy, especially for folks who are just getting started, to kind of start going down one road, and then get like the shiny object syndrome, right? So, oh, but I could talk about this other thing over here too, or I could have this different, topic or format of show. And that's cool, right? But as long as you're still staying on topic and you're talking to your ideal listener, so don't go kind of veering off course too much once you've defined who that ideal person is, that kind of is your ideal listener and what they are most interested in. And this kind of goes to our next one too, when it comes to guests, is having guests on your podcast is a really great way to expand your podcast reach and audience. But part of the trap of having someone on your podcast who's not a good fit for your audience persona and the topic that you're talking about is that your audience will hear this person on your podcast and say, Craig, what are you talking about? What is this person doing on my podcast? I have no idea how this is relevant to me, or the stuff you're talking about isn't interesting to me. And so I think, if you get a successful podcast, you will get pitched a lot for people to come on your podcast. And I think you have to be really, really protective of the identity and the brand of your show, especially as you get more and more successful, because you'll have people coming from all different directions saying, hey, I want to be on your podcast. I think I could talk about this and it'll be really interesting to your audience. And you have to kind of filter that and say, yeah, I think that might be interesting, or no, I don't think that's a good fit for us. Sorry, maybe we can revisit this another time. So I think you kind of have to put up those boundaries a little bit, or at least filter kind of what people are saying about them coming on your show and talking about a thing. Is that thing congruent with what your ideal listener wants to hear about? We talked our topic, or kind of mini topic of last week's office hours, was creating opportunities for audience engagement, and kind of how to do that and why it's important. But the real so what here is like, podcasting by its nature and by itself is like a one-way medium. So you talk and your audience listens. And the place where really successful podcasts shine is when they can continue that discussion later. So your podcast might be the starting point for a discussion, and then it continues in a Facebook group, or it continues in your local um, group, church group or something like that. That's really where the podcast is a part of a bigger brand that you end up building, and doesn't just stand by itself. So think about ways that you can use your podcast or things you can talk about on your show to create audience engagement. And we can, if you go to castos.com/blog, you'll see kind of a summary and the video from last week's office hours. And so it's definitely worth checking out, because I think this is maybe the one key for creating a successful podcast in general, and definitely is applicable to creating really great content, is encouraging and finding ways for your audience to participate in the shows and the content. The next one is something that, again, folks who are just getting started might have trouble with, because the first time you record yourself on a podcast and hear your own voice, you're going to say, oh my God, I don't really sound like that, do I? And yes, that's what you sound like. And it's cool. It's fine. It's great. And really embrace it and love it, and go with it, and be bold and different and opinionated. And for some people, you want to be somebody that they don't like, right? So you think about folks like Howard Stern, maybe, right? Like Howard Stern is the epitome of this, right? A lot of people don't like Howard Stern, but a lot of people really love him. And so for, think of kind of what your flavor of Howard Stern might be, right? So you don't want to go all the way to that side of the spectrum of like being a shock jock or something like that. But you do want to stand out, and you can do that in a really subtle way that's tasteful. But if you just do the same thing that everybody else does and have the same opinions and express them in the same way, then people are just going to listen to that other podcast that has 250 episodes and not yours that has 10. And so this is a way that you can stand out pretty easily. And you just have to kind of do some self-reflection, I think, and come to grips with the fact that you're putting your voice on air, and a bunch of people are going to listen, and some of them might not like it. And you got to say, that's cool, because I'm proud and confident of who I am and what I'm talking about. We could have a whole discussion on this, Denise. I think this is a really big one. The next one kind of goes back to the same thing of being different, but with guests. The best interview shows that I listen to are the ones that have someone on that I've heard on other podcasts before, but they talk about something totally different. And this is where the host of that show has listened to a bunch of interviews with Tim Ferriss or whoever, and then they ask Tim Ferriss questions that you've never heard somebody ask him before. And so you hear this person that you feel like you're really familiar with, and you might know them like in real life, but you hear them talk about something that you've never heard them talk about before, and that's like magic, right? Because then your audience says, I know this person, I can relate with this person, I kind of know where they're coming from. But then you're hearing this whole other side of them and their story, and that arc takes like on a whole new shape. So this takes a fair amount of work, right? So if you have somebody, especially kind of like a high profile guest that a lot of your audience will know, you will want to listen to several or a dozen interviews with them to say, okay, they've talked about this thing a lot. I don't want to talk about that thing with them, because this is just the same as every other interview they've always done. And then find that unique angle to take with a guest. It'll really make your podcast, and that episode in particular, and that might be all you need to kind of launch your podcast, but it'll make that episode in particular really stand out for your audience, and could kind of go viral from there. So those are the 7 ways that we like to think about creating standout content. And I'd love to hear, either in the chat or in questions, things that folks have done to kind of make their content stand out and make their podcast stand out in different ways. It could be things like formats or types of guests they have on. It could be how often and when and where they publish, live streaming, things like that. There's a lot of ways to go about this. But I think the big thing is we had 7 ways to do it here today. I think we should be doing all of these things, but there's a whole bunch of other things out there. And part of office hours is not just us talking and everyone else listening, but creating like a really cool dialogue and community with this. So if folks who are on the call have things they've done that have really worked, or haven't, would love to hear about it, and we can kind of chat through those as well.
And Craig, I'm also going to drop in our latest blog post where we've detailed 13, including these additional 7 other strategies for engaging podcast content to kind of get everyone to start brainstorming and kind of thinking about what to do for your show as well. And as we wait for more questions to filter in, I have a few written down for us to chat about beforehand. So I figure we can jump over those to get started.
Cool. Sounds good.
So you just mentioned about asking additional guests to come onto your podcast. Can you suggest other ways where we might be able to leverage that guest network to be able to grow my own audience for my own podcast?
Yeah, so I think that one of the ways that is pretty easy to do this is to kind of go to folks in your industry or your niche or your group who people think of as thought leaders, and kind of pitch them and say, hey, would love for you to come on my podcast. We get however many listeners. This is a really great platform for you to go and kind of share your perspective and your voice and everything with a whole bunch of people, and we'll help promote that, and it should grow kind of your notoriety in the space. A lot of people will say yes to that because you're offering them something really cool, even in 2019, where we think podcast is really mainstream. Because we're in this space, a lot of people don't think podcasting is mainstream and would be flattered, maybe nervous, to be on a podcast. And so you got a great opportunity. If you have a podcast, it is a platform for you to share what you know and think with the world, and including guests in that, and giving them the opportunity to kind of share part of your platform is a really cool opportunity. The other thing that we see a lot, particularly for businesses, and I think it could apply to like local organizations or political groups. Here we're coming up on the political season in the U.S. Is using your podcast as a networking opportunity. So not necessarily having a guest on for them to enjoy like the benefit of your audience, but to kind of have a good excuse to get on a call and chat with someone that you might not be able to get on a call with otherwise. So from a business perspective, you might think of this like as a sales call or a networking opportunity. To instead of going to have coffee or a drink with somebody, you say, hey, would you like to come on my podcast? We'll talk about A, B, and C. You talk about A, B, and C for an hour, and then this person instantly says, wow, Denise really knows what she's talking about. We talked about marketing for an hour, and she blew my mind with the stuff that she thinks and the questions that she asked and stuff. There are very few really true ways to do this these days, and I think a podcast is one of those. There are very few true ways that aren't just out and out asking, like, "Hey, would you like to go get a coffee?" But this is a really cool way that you can get a chance to talk with somebody that you admire and look up to and want to get to know better, in your business environment or in your local group or something like that. And using the podcast as a networking opportunity is a great way to do that. Did that kind of answer the question, Denise?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we often forget about kind of the networking opportunities that podcasts offer. And it's not a benefit that we should kind of gloss over, because it leads nicely into my next question for you, actually. I know we have a few people on the call who are just kind of starting out and maybe haven't published episodes yet. So what are like some of the other non-monetary benefits of podcasting? I know some people might want to get into it in order to bring on sponsors or advertisers, but I think there are, a whole slew of things to gain to be being the host of your own show and kind of talking about a topic that you're super passionate about. So I was hoping you can maybe dig into more of those benefits as well.
Yeah, so I think that I touched on one of them, and it's a thing that is kind of similar to some other marketing channels. So you think about like, having an email list of a bunch of engaged subscribers, and you send them an email once a week talking about your topic. They get a lot of value out of it. They reply back, and everybody like feels better because they're on that email list. And that's a platform. And it's a platform for you to share what you think with people in your world, and for them to like that content and get engaged with it, and you guys have a dialogue. And a podcast is just another form of that. So I think whether you monetize your podcast directly, and I say like monetizing it directly typically today means ads. And another way that like we're exploring with Castos is offering like paid subscriptions to like premium content. So we call it premium podcasting, to where kind of like a membership site for your podcast. You can say, okay, all of this content is free, but one episode a month or something like that is on this special podcast feed that is like $5 a month to get access to. So that's like, those are the two ways, here that in 2019 that folks are monetizing their podcast directly. And I think both have um, their kind of best ways and their pluses and minuses. But I think more so, and I say like more so, meaning there's like a higher upside to it, is using your podcast as a platform to further some other kind of venture. And whether that's a business or a church group or a local organization, or just your kind of, it's a hobby for you, and you love talking about the Green Bay Packers, that like having a podcast and doing that and having hundreds or thousands of people that listen to you every week, it creates a platform where you can talk and they listen and are engaged. And that at some point down the road, if you have something else that you want to talk about, then you have this thing built in, to where you can go on your podcast and talk about, okay, you're changing jobs and you're going to go look for a house somewhere else or whatever it is. You have a thing that people are really interested in, and then whatever else you decide to do with it later, you can do. Right now, if you build that platform and it is for your business, then you can create a lot of content around your business, or around promoting your local organization or something. And people say, wow, Denise's podcast is really great. She talks about whatever, basketball every week. This is really cool. And then Denise says, hey, I'm getting together a group here in Philadelphia to talk, to go play basketball every Wednesday or whatever it is. And that's a silly example maybe, but I think like using the platform example as an analogy is probably the most powerful thing. Cause then whatever else you decide to do with your podcast later on, and like that world that you're podcasting about, having this audience ready to go and engaged with you is like the most powerful thing, I think.
I totally agree. I think we're all kind of searching for our own little communities in this world, and podcasting is just another way that we can kind of tune into other people who are similar to us, and learn information about topics that we're super passionate about. And so Robert's just jumped into the chat saying he's just starting his podcast as well, and is really looking for the best ways to get the word out and learn all he can about getting themselves going, which I think leads in nicely to another question on, what would be the biggest mistakes new hosts might make in producing their podcast? What are kind of like the biggest hurdles that people new to this space need to figure out and, get over in order to be successful in launching their show?
Yeah, so you said a really funny word or term there, is kind of get over this thing. And like we have all these speed bumps that we put in our way, or roadblocks maybe even, that we put in our way mentally, right? In our own head, we say, holy cow, like I have to record the audio and I have to edit. And as Joanne is saying, what about, podcasting microphones, all this kind of stuff. And we put some of these barrier ups, I think, kind of subconsciously, to say like, I have to do all this stuff before I can, quote, have a podcast. Whereas the reality is you can plug your Apple earbuds into your computer, record on the software that comes with your computer, and then upload it to a hosting platform like Castos and publish it, and you have a podcast. It's not going to be the best podcast ever, right? But you could do that, and everyone on this show today could have a podcast that's live today. And so everything above that is like, some of it's really important, but some of it isn't, and it's important to different degrees. And so for folks who are just getting started, Robert and Joanne, I would say really evaluate what truly is important for you to get started, because the biggest hurdle people have in getting started is themselves, right? So you put up all of these objections kind of to yourself and say, I got to do all of this shit. Excuse me. I have to do all this stuff before I can have a podcast. When the reality is you don't. So we can definitely talk about, gear and stuff you need before you get started. But I would say preface all of that with, it really doesn't have to be that difficult. And you don't need to make it as difficult as you might think, or that other people on the internet say you have to do. You go through these 800 steps and be like semi-professional before you publish your first episode, because the truth is nobody's going to listen to your first episode, right? So kind of get over that like fear that when you put this out in the world, everyone and their mother is going to go listen to it, because that probably won't be true. And you will go back and listen to your first episode and say, I can't believe I published that. I am so embarrassed now, because now 200 episodes later, I am such a better podcaster. And I hope that's true. So I think just getting started is really the biggest thing that people have to get over. And a lot of times that's like this self-imposed doubt and kind of self-limiting behavior that we put in front of ourselves. So we will give some suggestions. So we have a really awesome and comprehensive blog post about how to get started. And I think Denise can put that in the chat here. And the kind of the big picture things that you really need is you should have a podcasting mic. If you can't afford one or don't want to buy one until you're sure that this is really going to work, earbuds like you get with your iPhone or your Android phone actually work pretty good. So don't like let that be the thing that holds you up. If you're looking for a mic, we recommend them in this article. One is the Audio Technica ATR 2100. We like it because it's really good. It's the microphone I use. You can't see it because it's just out of the picture. It costs about $65 on Amazon. The whole kit, like I have with the boom arm and the pop filter and stuff, costs about $100 on Amazon. And it is absolutely all you need to be a really successful podcaster. And from there, Joanne, a few other things that you need. So you need you should have a microphone. If you don't want to or can't afford one or don't want to wait or whatever, use the earbuds that come with your phone. They actually are really good if you're in a good environment. So go into a bedroom or something and close the door and turn the radio off and all this kind of stuff. You need a place to record your audio. And so recording and editing, we suggest a tool called Audacity, and we suggest it because it works on both Mac and on Windows. Sorry, I was reading the chat here from Robert and got sidetracked. So Audacity works on Mac and on Windows. It's free open source software. And you can both record locally. So unless you're like calling someone across the country, if it's just you or you and someone else in the same room, you can record and edit in the same software. That's awesome. And we have a bunch of tutorials on our YouTube channel about how to use Audacity. And if you just go to YouTube and type in Castos Audacity, it should pop right up. And then you need a host to host your files and create the RSS feed. And the RSS feed is kind of the thing that podcasting directories like Apple Podcast and Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify read and then show information about your podcast. And that's like the meta information, like the title and the description and the cover image and all that kind of stuff. And then every time you publish a new episode through your hosting platform, your RSS feed is updated automatically with that latest episode. And then directories like Spotify or Apple Podcasts say, oh, Denise has a new podcast episode. Here it is. And it sends it out automatically to all your subscribers. So Joanne, that's a really like terse 2-minute description of it. But hopefully that kind of helps with the big picture of like, find a way to record. Audacity is great. Use your earpiece or get a podcasting mic, record and edit the podcast and then publish it to your hosting platform, create that RSS feed, and then submit that RSS feed to places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and then publicize it and tell everybody about it.
Podcast and dropped our full kind of comprehensive guide into the chat if anyone wants more reference material or some more color there. So Carmen just popped into the chat. Thanks for joining us. About when doing interviews for people who may be remotely or locally, what kind of softwares to use for that, if you have any specific recommendations. I guess doing a call, it looks like more of a remote interview.
Yeah. So Carmen, if you could kind of specify, are you talking about like calling someone on the phone or doing a web-based call like this? Because depending on what you're doing, we have different recommendations. These days, so the podcasting world is really dynamic and stuff is changing a lot. But these days, the tool Okay, calling on the phone. I'll take that one in just a minute because that one's easy. For folks who are just getting started and want to do something on the computer like this, like Denise is on her computer, I'm on my computer. We're actually on different sides of the world, and it works like magic, thankfully. And like we use a specific webinar software for this, but for podcasting, you want to use a piece of software that's specific for podcasting. And the tool we like these days is called Squadcast. So it's squadcast.fm. And there's another tool called Zencaster, zencaster.com, so Zencastr.com. Both of them are specific just for podcasting, and they create really high quality local recordings for both you and your guest. And then those kind of sync up with either Dropbox or kind of whatever cloud storage you hook them up to. And the idea here is that you record a separate channel for you and for your guest, because that will make your life in post-production and in editing really easy. If everybody is squashed down into the same channel, then editing and volume levels and weird over talking each other and stuff like that is just impossible. But to your question about calling someone on the phone, the tool that we really like is called Zoom. Zoom.us. Zoom is like a conference calling service that definitely has a very solid free plan. I think they have free calls up to 40 minutes last time I checked. And the cool thing about Zoom, as opposed to like Squadcast or Zencaster, is that there is like dial-in information. So if anybody's like been on a conference call for their work, you know that most of the time you just call in, you're on the phone, but the people who are presenting are typically on their computer. And so that's cool in your case, because you can be on your computer and are recording this somehow in something like Zoom. And then your guests can just call in from their phone, and they don't have to have a special setup or anything like that. So Zoom is a really cool option there. The thing I would suggest is to prep your guest a little bit and say, this is not just a phone call. Don't be on the interstate driving, 80 miles an hour while we're doing this. Be at home in your office or in your bedroom with the door closed, and try as best you can to create like a good recording environment. If you could have a headset on, so like the one that comes with your iPhone or your Android phone, just because that is a specific kind of microphone just for recording kind of better audio than your phone does kind of natively. Don't use your office phone on speaker or in the conference room or something like that, because it just sounds horrible. So Carmen, that's kind of my suggestion for recording good remote interviews.
To your question, thanks for popping that in there. So John mentions he's been interviewing a lot of industry leaders from his space and has been gaining some traction, but wants to try out some other formats like panels or case studies or monologues. Do you have any suggestions about maybe should he change the intro, or should he do some sort of differentiating factor for these new formats, or should he just kind of jump into it and kind of expect that his audience will appreciate the variety?
Yeah. So, hey, John, how you doing? I know we've chatted a lot in some questions at Castos. So thanks for joining us today. I think this is a really interesting question, and this is something I would like to hear other people who have done this kind of chime in on. We might need to like open this up to our Facebook group to ask people their opinions on this. John, I'll give you my take on it. And my take on it is that I haven't done this. So I'll tell you what I think, kind of having lived in the podcasting world for like 4.5 years. I think you absolutely should try this. And I say try it because in a lot of kinds of content and in marketing, you don't know until you try it. And so Denise and I try a lot of marketing stuff, and some of it doesn't work. And that you have to kind of go into it knowing that. And the way, John, that you'll know it doesn't work is if your download numbers kind of suffer after you start this. And so it's like a fair risk. And I would mitigate that risk by going to some of like your best audience members or people that you know well that will give you honest feedback ahead of time and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing where instead of having an interview show, I monologue or I do a panel discussion with like 3 other people. What do you think? And if you ask enough people that have enough different perspectives and come from different angles in your world, you should get a sense for like, okay, this is a terrible idea and I definitely shouldn't do this. Or, well, yeah, they think this is interesting. We should try this. And like you've mitigated that downside risk at least by getting some opinions of people that you know and respect up front. And the one kind of qualifier I would use there is to say, like, you gotta filter where people are coming from when they give you opinions like this. Like, if you ask somebody to be on your panel and then ask if you think this is a good idea, like, you're gonna get yes, right? Because people are gonna like jump up and down to be on your podcast. Um, but if you're going to just frame it as like an abstract question, then you might get a different answer from that same person. So I would say, just like as you're asking this question and getting those responses, just think about like where someone is coming from in this respect, because that will kind of color what their response means to you. But I definitely would explore it. I would explore it before doing it, and kind of test the waters with people. But I think that we see a lot of podcasts have a lot of success with this. And then if you do decide to do it, then kind of as Denise mentioned, you definitely should prep your audience for it. Maybe it's like the episode ahead of time to say, hey, in our next episode, we're going to be switching things up a little bit. We're going to have a roundtable discussion where it's me and 3 or 4 different people talking about this one particular topic, instead of John, just you and a guest talking about, your topic, where that like people have a different kind of emotional relationship with that kind of content. So if you do decide to go in a different format direction, to either prep your audience at the beginning of that episode or at the end of a previous episode to say, hey, next week it's going to be different. And just get ready. I hope you enjoy it. If you don't, please let me know. Again, encouraging kind of audience participation and feedback is huge. And however you do that, whether it's comments in the blog post or your Facebook group or your local organization or in an email or whatever, let people know that you want their feedback, because that's huge. And honestly, that's challenging. Our podcast, we've been going 200 episodes, and it's still hard sometimes to get feedback from folks who are listening. And I think that's just kind of the nature of podcasting.
It's also a good
Again, if
point.
anybody has
Some
nailed that,
of
I would
my
love
favorite
to.
podcasts
I'd love to
who
hear how,
change up
because
their formats,
I
week
think it's
to
a really
week.
difficult
They also
time.
name the segments a little bit differently than their normal shows, so you can kind of parse them out when you're kind of scrolling through or browsing through their episodes. So if maybe it's something I don't really like, but I like the show overall, I can maybe skip that particular episode, but continue engaging with things. And potentially try introducing these new formats in segments rather than creating a full separate standalone show with this different format. Maybe if you're a little bit nervous in dipping your toe into the water, it could be a nice way to at least try it out and see if it's something that you're interested in. But yes, managing expectations of your audience are always difficult things to do. So kind of scrolling back up in the chat, Robert had a really interesting question about advertising and whether or not it's worth paying for or using paid sources for advertising for your podcast. Do you have any suggestions, or would you recommend going more organic routes? What's kind of your take on that, Craig?
Yeah, Robert, this is a super interesting topic, and I know several people that have been very, very, very successful with this. So there are a lot of places you can advertise for your podcast. So it's funny you say like podcast advertising, and everybody instantly thinks like you having Casper mattresses ad spots on your podcast, and that's not what I don't think that's what Robert's talking about. I think Robert's talking about, can he pay to advertise on Facebook or in the Overcast podcast app for his podcast to draw people in to listen and subscribe to it. And so that's kind of taking the advertising and podcasting model and flipping it on its head a little bit. You can even advertise on other podcasts directly. So you can have your own soundbite in other podcasts. Robert, if you are podcasting for your business or something that kind of makes money, or you're happy to kind of throw money at to grow your podcast, I absolutely would do this. I think that a lot of people podcast for a very long time and then they stop because they don't see any growth. So if you feel confident that like you're creating really interesting and engaging content and that your audience is going to love it, you just got to find more of your audience. And if you're kind of starting from scratch in the audience realm in general, that I think that advertising for your podcast is really an interesting thing to look at. And I mentioned some of the places I would start looking at that. One is Facebook, just because Facebook is a really advanced kind of advertising platform. Whether we love Zuckerberg or hate him, like it's just a really interesting, powerful place to reach people on a topic. And that's the thing that Facebook does differently than like Google search or something like that. The other place I absolutely would look at is the Overcast podcast app. So I think it's overcast.fm. They allow advertising on like a monthly or weekly basis. And it's just a little bar in the bottom of the app that suggests podcasts that you might be interested in. So they kind of topically align what you're listening to with ads that they've kind of sold that are in the similar vein. So those are the two places I would look. And then, Robert, if you know other people that have podcasts in the space that you're looking at, I would pitch them to say, hey, can I buy an ad spot on your podcast? You might want to like not exactly be in the same vein as them because like you don't want to be stealing their listeners, but maybe like a show that's slightly different, to where there wouldn't be as much direct competition. Um, would be interesting there. So I would look at those three things as like a good place to start. And then Robert, if you haven't joined our Facebook group, you just go to Facebook and type in Podcast Hackers. That's our Facebook group. We had a discussion around this a while back, but I'm sure if you popped in and posed this question there, I know there are people that have been super successful with that
A
in
nice
our Facebook
compliment
group.
now. Thanks, Robert.
And
A nice
they could
compliment
chime in with
now
some stuff
would be maybe some
they've done
organic
successfully
channels
there
as well. So we kind of have our paid strategy down. If we're going to buy some airtime on other podcasts, use Facebook advertising. What are some other channels we could leverage to help grow our audience if we're starting from scratch?
Yeah, so I think that if you're really starting from scratch, that interviews and having an interview-based podcast is a really easy way to grow your audience. It's how we grew our audience at the beginning, and we talked about this networking opportunity, and especially if you network and have other podcasters on your podcast, then it can really grow like wildfire. So Carmen, talking about growing your audience from scratch, not sure the exact kind of format of your podcast or kind of what you're going to be interested in or talking about. But if I were just starting today, I would have at least some interviews. Some might just be me, talking, or me and a co-host or something like that. But I think having guests on your podcast and being really strategic about who those people are, um, is a really great way to build your audience. And I say being really strategic about who those people are because it can be a little counterintuitive. If you think about like who you want to get on your podcast, it's not the biggest name out there that typically has the biggest impact on your listenership. It usually is like someone who is kind of really aligned with your purpose, and you guys have similar audience personas. Um, but they're like at a similar point in the journey or the scale of their podcast and their kind of notoriety in your space, maybe like a step or two ahead of where you are. Um, Not 10 or 100 steps or in like a different stratosphere, because those people, the stuff you'll talk about will not really be relatable to your audience, right? If your audience is talking about um, beginner runners who want to finish a 5K, and you get on Meb Keflezighi, right, the guy that won the Boston Marathon a couple of years ago, like Meb and you are going to talk about stuff that people who are just wanting to finish their first 5K have no idea about, right? So it's like he's a really great name, and I'm sure the notoriety of that would do a lot for your podcast, but your audience is not going to relate to that at all, really. And then similarly, if he shares that episode out on social media, it's not going to do a whole lot to move the needle in terms of like, oh, this person listens or was on this podcast, I should go listen to it as well. Whereas if you have someone who's kind of like in a similar space to you and has audience that's similar to the audience that you want on your podcast, that tends to move the needle a lot more. It's a little counterintuitive. We see this over and over, that like the bigger names that you have on your podcast don't always do the most for audience growth. It's really those people kind of closer to where you are in your kind of world. So that's kind of guests and interviews, and I would say the other really good one is social media. So depending on what you're talking about, I think the social media platform that is the best fit for that will differ. For some, it's Instagram, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Pinterest. And then not exactly social media, but like email list building, and getting people to your site and offering them something in return for their email address is a really great way to build your audience. And I think with both of those, the key is to create useful content and share it with people, and in return they will follow you, and then you can mention your podcast. And that's kind of the very brief version of like how organic social media works. Is just be out there, be communicating and engaging with people in your space, sharing interesting and helpful stuff, and then they get to know, like, and trust you, and then they'll follow your podcast when you kind of mention it there as well. So Carmen, I hope that helps. That's a pretty brief thing, as far as kind of like growing your audience from scratch. But really, I think the big one is kind of like, if you have some kind of audience or have some kind of presence in your world that you're going to be podcasting about, just do a lot more of that, because that's the easiest thing. So don't start from scratch with a new Twitter account today.
I totally
If you already
agree. I
have
also think
100 people on your
that your
email
point
list
about
and you have this
cross-pollination in these
thing working,
partnerships is
just
a really
like
great
whatever the
place to
thing is,
explore,
just go
and
to a
would
whole lot more of it,
recommend
and then introduce your
checking
podcast
out our Facebook
into
group or the
that
other
medium.
podcast-specific Facebook groups. There are a lot of
Cool.
people there who are kind of putting calls out about having guests come on their show. So it might be at least a good place to start to see who may be out there and who might be in your space, where you guys can kind of create this partnership together and mutually be growing your audiences, by leveraging each other's networks. I think that's great advice.
And you never know. Like, it's amazing. Like, the people I have met through podcasting are, it sounds funny to say out loud, like some of my best friends are people that I've met through podcasting. And now, like, I run a podcasting business and they run this other business that's like in a similar space maybe. And we met because I invited them on my podcast. And now we see each other a few times a year at conferences, or they live the next town over. It just happens, or whatever. Like, yeah, I think just getting on the phone and chatting with interesting people is really powerful. And you never know, right? It could be a dud, and it could be something that like, oh, the discussion's not interesting, and you might never publish that interview, right? That's the thing, is like, there are definitely podcast interviews that have been done that are not published, and that's cool. And you can kind of say to that person, like, hey, I really enjoyed our talk, but I just don't think it's like what we ended up talking about is not
Maybe
really
an
a good
opportunity to
alignment
publish at a later
with
date if
what my
it's something
audience is
more
interested in.
evergreen.
So, like,
It's
we're going
okay
to
if
keep it.
things
I'm
end up on the
glad
cutting room
we
floor
chatted,
sometimes.
but I
think so.
can't like share that with my audience because it's not.
So
it's
kind of
not
one of
aligned
my
with
last
kind of what
questions
I'm doing.
that is related to this guesting and being on other people's podcasts. Do you have any best practices for when maybe you're appearing on someone else's show, or you're asking someone else to appear on your show, kind of before you guys get behind the mic? What are some best practices I should be following to get me there?
Yes. Yeah. So I think so it's two different things really. I talk about both. One is, if you are having someone on your podcast, the one thing well, two things you definitely should do is do your homework. If you don't know this person really well, do your homework about other podcasts they've been on, or do they have their own podcast? What their business or interests or whatever are all about. Do that ahead of time. So you know what you're talking about this person about, and like, have they been on a bunch of other podcasts and have they talked about this one particular thing a whole lot? Then don't talk to them about that, because nobody wants to hear the same story from the same person a bunch. And the other is to send them a pretty simple email ahead of time, like a couple days ahead of time, and say, hey, just a reminder, we're going to be on a podcast at noon on Thursday. We're going to be talking about this. Maybe give them a couple bullets of what you're going to be talking about, and then give them like some real tactical, practical prep things for them physically to be doing. So be at your computer and have a earpiece on, or if you have a podcasting mic, that's even better. Be in the room with the door closed, and like, not be where the trash truck is pulling up out front with the window open. Turn all of the other apps on your computer off, and just kind of be ready to podcast. We'll be podcasting for an hour, and we typically chat for 5 minutes, and then we will, Q&A for 45 minutes or something like that. This is one of those things where, like, an ounce of prevention with that email ahead of time is like a pound or a ton of results later. I can't tell you how many times I've sent this email and people said, "Oh, I can't." I hadn't thought about this, or I wasn't going to be ready. Thanks so much for sending this. And then we end up, recording good sounding audio. They're there, they're prepared, and we have a really cool discussion. Conversely, I think when you're talking on someone else's podcast, it's a little bit of the same prep. Like if I'm going on someone else's podcast, I absolutely want to know, like, what do we typically talk about? What are like some of their most popular episodes, and what are the things that people have talked about on those episodes that really resonated with the audience? And then you can and should ask the host, okay, hey, we're going to come talk about this thing. What does your audience typically look like? What do they want to hear most about? When you have a really successful podcast episode, what does that episode look like? What things does it have or doesn't it have? So that I can tailor kind of my approach and my answers and my presentation to things that are really interesting to your audience. And I think if you do that, that will be a signal to the host, like, wow, Craig is really on this. He knows what he's talking about. And when people have said that to me, I'm like, okay, this is going to be a good episode. Like this person 100% knows what they're talking about. My trust and confidence in them grows, which for folks who are just getting started, you will quickly find that like you can't trust people on your podcast because especially if they haven't podcasted a lot, they won't know what you know or what you want them to do. And so, for someone who comes in and knows a lot about that kind of side of the content creation and alignment with your audience and the goals that they have, that's massively helpful for you as a host. So those are the two sides of like being a guest and having people on as guests that I think are
And
really
I think
important
another
to
benefit of coming
consider
in,
and put in
you
place.
being
And
a guest on someone else's
doing those
show,
things ahead
coming
of
in
time
prepared and
makes the content
providing
better,
really great
makes your
answers
guests more
is
at home
impressing
and
their
has
audience,
them
right? If
be
you
comfortable with
sounds like a great guest and you,
with what
are super knowledgeable about what you're talking about and answering the questions in a very interesting way, you're really enticing their audience to come check out your show later on, which is kind of what we were talking about before, that cross-pollination, that partnership. It's a benefit not to forget. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And conversely, messing that up will certainly mean that nobody that listens to your interview on another show is going to come listen to your podcast. So, yeah, I mean, I take, it's kind of like if folks have been blogging, like Denise and I at Castos take guest blogging on another blog more seriously than our own blog, right? Because it is, in a lot of chances, the one chance we get to show what we're all about when we get to post on another, especially like a high profile, but really all other places we get to publish content, that is typically our best stuff. And so I try very hard when I'm on another podcast, especially if it's a really popular one, to do everything I can to put my best foot forward, give my best content, be ready, be prepared, have interesting questions to ask the guest, because that's like a lifesaver when you have interesting things that you can contribute back to the discussion. So yeah, I think, really putting your best foot forward when you're a guest will go a long way towards having that cross pollination and the growth of your own audience. Cool. Well, I think that wraps us up for this edition of Office Hours. I hope everyone really enjoyed it, and thank you all very much for your questions. We do these. Sorry. Kurt just popped in with a question. For those of us just starting, do we need to start with guests or try to build our audience first? Yeah, the chicken or the egg. Kurt, I think that kind of like we talked about earlier, that having guests on your podcast is a really good way to build your audience. So I think that even if you're just starting, having guests is a thing that you should do if you don't have another way that you're prepared to grow your audience. So I think it kind of depends on kind of like where you're coming from and what your growth strategy is going to be and what other kind of audience you have in other kind of media. So I think it depends is kind of the answer, but I don't think it's bad to have guests on if you don't have any listeners, right? Like there are plenty of podcasts that start from they all start from nothing, and you have a guest on and you tell them like, hey, we're just getting started. I would love to have you on as my first or second or third guest because I know and respect you, and hopefully we can kind of build this thing together from there. That's perfectly fine. I think you're being honest and upfront with a person, and they should respect that and go with it. I don't think it's bad Kurt, is what I'm getting at. Is I don't think it's bad to say, yep, I'm going to have some guests on in the first couple of episodes of my podcast. I would say kind of strategically, I wouldn't have on like your perfect ideal audience or your perfect ideal guest before you have an audience. So like if you're thinking about like having Seth Godin on your podcast, don't have him on in the first episode. So wait till you have some listeners so that they can kind of appreciate the content that you're creating. But have folks on that are friendly and are approachable and can help you grow this thing together. And a lot of folks, especially people that are other podcasters, will totally do that because they were there and they remember what it's like to start out and not having a huge audience, and they'll help you along the way. So I'd say like, pick that guest or those guests kind of strategically as you're getting started to say like, who are people that can help me along the way as guests on my podcast. So Kurt, I hope that's helpful. So we mentioned about our Facebook group in the discussion today a few times. So Denise popped the link to that in the chat over here for folks who kind of, if you have questions between now and next week's Office Hours edition, feel free to hop in the Facebook group there and ask. It's not just me and Denise. There's hundreds of people in there that are talking about podcasting all day, every day. And it's a really cool way to get to know kind of other people in the podcasting world. It's called Podcast Hackers. So there's the link again. But just go into Facebook and type in Podcast Hackers, and you should see it right away. So we have Office Hours every Wednesday at noon Eastern. Next week we are mixing things up a little bit, as John mentioned. Our format is changing. We're having a co-host on next week. So Nathan Wrigley from the WP Builds podcast is coming on to kind of co-host with me. Nathan is a full-time professional podcaster, so it's all he does. He does have multiple different content formats, so that'll be interesting. John, to your point, we can ask him about that, and is a super knowledgeable and interesting guy. So I'm looking forward to having him on the show next week, and he and I will just going to be chatting for the first 10 or 15 minutes about himself and kind of what he's learned, and then we'll be taking questions for the rest of the time. So if you haven't yet, please sign up for Podcast Hours, for Podcast Office Hours, and we'll see everybody next Wednesday at noon Eastern. Thanks so much.